Okay everyone, we're going to be talking about Cathartic Magic, which is magic that comes from the intense release of deeply welled up emotions. Now, as I am aware of the kind of danger that such a conversation can unleash, I want you to know that I have taken several precautions to ensure that I am not exposed to any frustrating or upsetting information today so that I don't accidentally trigger some kind of overwhelming reaction. Oh hey, hold on a second, I just got some notifications on my phone. What's that? They're out of French bread pizza at the grocery store? And the UK Wildcats were knocked out in the first round of the NCAA basketball tournament? And I've got a reminder to go do my taxes? Today, let's talk about the Cathartic Magic variant rules for Pathfinder 2nd Edition on this episode of The Local Disaster Tour Guide. Hello travelers and tourists, my name is Mark and I am the Local Disaster Tour Guide. That's right, I'm a storyteller who only has one problem with Cathartic Magic, and that is that Paizo did not give us a hangry emotional state as part of this rule set. Come on Paizo, are you really going to try to convince me that no wizard has ever accidentally maliciously fireballed a bandit camp after forgetting to pack adequate snacks for their road trip? I think we know this needs to be part of the rules. Welcome to a journey through the fantastic world of TTRPGs like Pathfinder and Starfinder. Today, we're going to be taking a look at one of my favorite variant rules for Pathfinder 2nd Edition, which is Cathartic Magic. This comes from the book Secrets of Magic, and it's one of these spellcasting variants that you can find in the back of that book in the Book of Unlimited Magic section. There are a number of different archetypes and variant rules that allow you to play with how magic is used inside of your campaign setting. And if I'm being completely transparent, I honestly meant to start covering these a lot sooner and time just kind of got away from me. But today I wanted to dive into my favorite variant from Secrets of Magic, which is Cathartic Magic, talk a little bit about what it does, talk about the options it presents, and give you a taste of some of the narrative opportunities that it offers. I think this rule set offers easily some of the greatest narrative potential to game masters and players in Pathfinder 2e, and if you really want to mess around with magic in your system, I think that this is a variant that is worth checking out. So if you want to see what the emotion of dedication does for a wizard, or if you want to experience the powerful effects of misery with your oracle, or maybe play a sorcerer with anger mirroring that of the party barbarian, follow along with this conversation. This might be the rule set for you. But before we dive into all of that, you can help me experience the cathartic magic of joy by doing all of that YouTube stuff that helps support the channel. If you enjoy this video today, please remember to like it and share it. And if you're not subscribed to the channel, please subscribe so that you can get notifications when new content goes live. I also invite you to leave your observations in the comments section down below. I have a fantastic community here, and my interactions with you all are some of the best parts of this job. And speaking of this community, you can check out my free Discord page, which has a link in the video description. Also down there, you can find a link to my Patreon page. And speaking of the catharsis of joy, I want to give a shout out to the first ever guide tier patron for this channel, Fasten. Thank you so much for your support, for your encouragement, and for everything you do to help make this channel a success. Okay, so today I would like to give a huge shout out to the sponsor for this episode, ArcKnight. ArcKnight is a company based out of Texas that makes accessories for tabletop RPGs like D&D and Pathfinder. They use a durable die-cut plastic to come up with, to be honest, an incredible array of different products, such as flat plastic minis, maps, object sheets, and the item that we're going to be advertising in this particular video, spell templates. Now, this is a relatively new item from ArcKnight. These are Pathfinder 2nd Edition specific spell templates, and as you can see, I haven't even opened the package yet, but I can already tell you that I love these spell templates because, well, to be honest, I sort of already have them. A couple of years ago, I purchased ArcKnight's D&D 5e spell templates for use in my Pathfinder games, and I am excited that they now have Pathfinder-specific templates I get to use. So I'm going to open these up, and we're going to take a look at how you use them. As you can see here, our adventuring party is facing off against an evil sorceress. And there's a number of different spells that might get employed during such a fight. For example, the evil sorceress might summon a creature to aid her in battle. Or she might summon something a little bit bigger. The evil sorceress could also try to hinder the party by throwing down a spell like Grease to interrupt the movement of the party's warrior. It's very easy to slide them underneath of a figure or a pawn to help record the location of hindering effects on the battlefield. The text of the various spells are written on one side of the spell effects, meaning that you have quick access to the rules associated with the particular spell. Now, the sorceress is not the only one who's got some tricks up her sleeve. Ampara, the party druid, has access to the Dragon Breath spell, which he can easily lay down to show the area of effect and blast the evil sorceress in question. It seems that the evil sorceress in this instance was not prepared for the party, so she's going to drop an Obscuring Mist spell to cover her retreat. As you can see, these spell effects are colorful, easy to use, visible to the entire table, and a fantastic addition to your collection. So that's a quick overview of how you can use spell templates at your gaming table, and I just want to say there's a ton of stuff that I love about these templates. I love how colorful they are, I love how easy they are to use, and one of the things I love about all ArcKnight products is how incredibly easy to store they are. One of the challenges of tabletop RPGs as a hobby is finding space to put all of your stuff. But one of the great things about these simple plastic accessories that ArcKnight offers is they are very easy to store and to put away, and they don't take up a ton of room. My wife and I are super excited to be working with ArcKnight. We have been a customer of them for years. We've done several of their Kickstarters. I've actually talked to them at Gen Con a couple of times, and they are a fantastic company, and they have fantastic customer service. I've placed many orders over the years, and on the single occasion that I had an order go wrong, their customer service team was extremely quick to respond and fix the problem. So ArcKnight produces incredible accessories, you get a ton of stuff at a fantastic price, and their team is professional, courteous, and ready to help you upgrade your game. So I'll throw a link to them in the video description. You can go over and check them out and let them know that the Disaster Tour Guide sent you. Alright, let's dive into Cathartic Magic and talk about what this rule set is, what this rule set offers, and what kind of stories we can tell using this particular variant. So if you're interested in the Cathartic Magic rules variant, you're going to need access to the book Secrets of Magic, and as I mentioned earlier, this is one of the variants discussed in the back of that book in the Book of Unlimited Magic chapter. Cathartic Magic can be found from pages 194 to 197, And Cathartic Magic is, in short, described as the process of purging deep pent-up emotions to gain powerful magic effects. However, this process of purging such deep and such intense emotions comes with some potential downsides in the form of emotional fallout that a character must recover from after they engage in the use of Cathartic Magic. There are several reasons that I think Cathartic Magic is easily the most exciting spellcasting variant in the book Secrets of Magic. One of them is pure mechanical variety. Here in a bit, we will talk about the Cathartic Mage Archetype and all of the feats that are used to describe and implement Cathartic Magic. But what I think is interesting is even though Cathartic Magic has a single archetype that is used for the rule set, there are actually 10 different emotional states that Paizo has fleshed out for use with Cathartic Magic, meaning functionally you have an archetype that has 10 different variants which can be applied anywhere and everywhere. You could have a bard whose music and magic becomes more inspiring as they fall deeper in love. Or maybe you could control a magus who unlocks additional abilities when they become overwhelmed by fear. 10 different emotional states functionally turns this into 10 different archetypes that are each going to interact with the spellcasting rules in Pathfinder 2e in their own unique way, and one of the best parts of this is Cathartic Magic can be applied to any spellcasting class in the game and any non-spellcasting class in the game as well. Sure, I could roleplay a cleric driven by the Cathartic Magic associated with Remorse, but I could also play a standard fighter who, in a moment of pure awe, unlocks their own unique brand of magic associated just with these intense emotions that they have felt and have learned how to use. This is one of the most mechanically flexible and nuanced archetypes in the entire game, and I absolutely love the sheer mechanical variety that the Cathartic Mage Archetype offers when you're talking about spellcasting in 2e. On top of that mechanical variety, you also have a ton of role-playing potential built into this concept of Cathartic Magic. This rule set will very naturally make you think about the emotional state of the character that you're portraying, and will very naturally make you want to respond to the emotional experiences that your character is having. And I think the role-playing and narrative potential associated with Cathartic Magic is absolutely phenomenal. Over the years, I've seen many players struggle to represent spellcasters well, and I think that Cathartic Magic is actually a useful tool, not just for modifying magic, but for actually helping you get inside the head of the spellcaster that you're playing at the gaming table. Now, before we go into the details of Cathartic Magic, I do want to say that on the subject of role-playing, there are some heavy considerations that go into using Cathartic Magic at your gaming table. Subjects like fear and misery and remorse are very powerful emotions, and the role-playing implications of those at the gaming table are something that you do want to be mindful of. Additionally, some of the emotional states described in Cathartic Magic will have a focus for the emotion that could, in some circumstances, almost be described as an obsessive focus. And again, this is one of those areas where the role-playing implications of this particular rule set is something you want to think through. So if you are interested in Cathartic Magic, I would encourage you to hunt down Secrets of Magic and spend some time reading through that section. They give some really good advice to players, some really good advice to game masters, and they do a good job of talking about the different issues that might come into this style of storytelling. So I think Paizo did a good job here of not just creating an interesting rule set and creating good narrative opportunities, but also of providing support for people who are interested in this so that it goes well at your gaming table. We don't have time to dive into all of those subjects for this video, but I do encourage you check some of that information out because I do feel Paizo handled this conversation well. With all of the mechanical and role-playing implications that come with Cathartic Magic, Paizo did give Cathartic Magic the uncommon tag, and they did that specifically because there are a lot of things that game masters will want to consider in using Cathartic Magic. So for players and game masters alike, I do recommend reading up on this rule set before diving into this rule set so that you can make sure you're getting the most out of it in play. Now, when it comes to Cathartic Magic, there is a lot of different information that goes into this rule set. There is a full archetype that you can use to access Cathartic Magic, and then there are a number of different keywords and terminology that you need to know. However, I'd like to start our discussion of Cathartic Magic by talking about the emotional states. Paizo gives us 10 different emotional states that are associated with Cathartic Magic, and if you decide that your character would like to take the Cathartic Mage dedication, the very first choice that they're going to make is they're going to choose one emotional state that is the driver of their magic. So, really quick, let's list off the emotional states that Paizo offers for this particular dedication. Anger, awe, dedication, fear, hatred, joy, love, misery, pride, and remorse. Every Cathartic Mage will need to choose one of those 10 options, and that emotion is going to become the driving force for the powerful outburst of magic that your character is capable of using. And right off the bat, you can see that there is a ton of variety here, and you can very easily create very different characters just by picking a different emotional state as the core of your particular dedication. A sorcerer driven by the emotional state of anger compared to a sorcerer driven by the emotional state of remorse are two very different characters and can open up two very different types of stories. There is nothing in this rule set that limits particular emotions to particular classes, so any class can potentially match to any emotion, creating a wide variety of different character concepts. Now, we will come back to the emotional states in a little bit and go through what each emotional state offers if that's the one that you choose, but next I want to move on to the key terms and definitions that are associated with the Cathartic Magic rules. You'll have a cathartic trigger, a cathartic reaction, an activation, an emotional fervor, an emotional fallout, and a focus spell. So really quick, what do all of these mean? A trigger is exactly what it sounds like. It is a situation that can trigger the powerful emotional reactions and powerful magic that your character has the ability to use. Now, one thing that I will say is Paizo has done a good job of making these triggers very clear mechanically defined things inside of Pathfinder 2e. For example, the fear emotional state has a trigger that an enemy causes you to gain the frightened condition. So the associated abilities wouldn't be usable anytime your character might be anxious, but instead has that specific mechanical definition. You must have the frightened condition, and it must be caused in some fashion by something your enemy has done. Each emotional state comes with very specific mechanical triggers that allow you to access your powers. Now, if you do encounter your trigger, you gain the catharsis reaction, which is basically where your character unleashes that emotion. When you use the catharsis reaction, you gain the catharsis activation ability, which is some kind of special ability that will apply immediately to your character. And this is going to vary from emotional state to emotional state. We'll get into the specifics here in a minute, but just know that when your character uses their catharsis reaction, they get an activation ability that is some kind of buff or benefit specific for them. Once a character has this cathartic reaction, they enter a state called emotional fervor, which lasts for 3 rounds. In emotional fervor, there's going to be 2 different distinct abilities that you will have. One is you will gain access to a unique spell that you can only cast while you are in your emotional fervor state. Second, you will have some kind of buff or benefit associated with your emotional fervor that will apply for the entire duration of 3 rounds. However, all good things must end, and after 3 rounds, you lose the benefits of emotional fervor, and instead, you gain an emotional fallout, which represents the draining emotional fatigue that comes with trying to manage, well, such intense emotions. Emotional fallout will be some kind of specific mechanical penalty that will remain in place until your character has a chance to use the Settle Emotions activity, which we'll talk about a little bit more when we get to the archetype. The last key term that you need to be aware of is each emotional state will come with a cathartic focus spell of some kind, which is a focus spell that your character can use while they are in that state of emotional fervor. By the way, each emotional state that currently exists and the associated cathartic focus spell, they are all different cleric domain spells that have been transferred over to the Cathartic Magic rules. So right now, each of those focus spells are all going to be cleric domain spells, but they are all in the core rulebook, so don't worry about needing a lot of extra materials to access or use the Cathartic Magic system. So that's a lot of things to keep up with, but how do we gain access to Cathartic Magic? Well, there is a small Game Master focused paragraph about just dropping Cathartic Magic in when it might be fun for the story, but the primary thing that we need to focus in on is the Cathartic Mage Archetype, which is an archetype that grants you access to, well, all of the stuff that we've mentioned so far. It begins with a level 2 feat called the Cathartic Mage Dedication, and this dedication feat is going to require that you either have the ability to cast spells or a charisma score of 14. And this alternate requirement is a reflection of the fact that this is a dedication that can potentially apply to any class inside of the game. Any spellcasting class can potentially take the Cathartic Mage Dedication, or, as I mentioned before, a non-spellcaster could, in a very emotional moment, suddenly gain access to magic by taking this dedication as well. If your base class is a non-spellcaster, your Cathartic Magic is going to run off of Charisma, and that's the reason that Charisma 14 is one of the possible prerequisites for this particular dedication. When you choose the Cathartic Mage Dedication, there are a few different things that are going to happen. First, you will pick one of the 10 emotional states that Paizo has statted out as the emotional state that your Cathartic Mage knows how to access. Also, you will gain access to the Catharsis reaction and the Settle Emotions activity, and then, depending on which base class you come from, the dedication will have one of 3 possible effects. If you were previously a non-spellcaster, you become a spontaneous spellcaster. You gain access to a single tradition and a single cantrip from that tradition that you can now use going forward. If you were already a spontaneous spellcaster, the Cathartic Mage Dedication will give you an additional cantrip to add to your spell repertoire, and if you were previously a prepared spellcaster, you will gain the ability to prepare a specific cantrip associated with your tradition each day, in addition to the normal cantrips you could already use. Now, I know that's a lot of stuff to keep up with, but primarily you can think of it as you gain access to a cantrip, you gain access to the Catharsis reaction, the releasing of emotion associated with your emotional state, and then you gain the Settle Emotions activity. Settle Emotions is an activity that takes 10 minutes and allows you to essentially negate the penalties associated with the emotional fallout that you get from using your Cathartic Magic. Some of the other feats in the Cathartic Mage Archetype include Basic Spellcasting, Expert Spellcasting, and Master Spellcasting at levels 4, 12, and 18 respectively, and these will work like the Basic, Expert, and Master Spellcasting that you would find with other spellcasting archetypes, so there's not really a lot to go into here. There is also a feat available at level 4 called Cathartic Focus Spell, which is going to give you access to the focus spell associated with whatever emotional state you chose when you first stepped into this archetype. Much like the majority of abilities that give you access to focus spells, if you don't already have focus spells or focus points, taking this feat will give you a single focus point and access to the refocus activity. So those feats are pretty straightforward and easy to use. There are 2 more feats, however, that are a little more interesting and I think add a lot to this particular archetype. One is the Work Yourself Up feat, which is available at level 8, where your character basically works themselves into whatever emotional state they've learned how to master. In other words, you don't have to encounter the specific trigger that you've been looking for, but rather you can spend 2 actions on your turn and kind of work yourself into that mindset, gaining all of the normal abilities associated with your emotional state. The other feat that this archetype offers is called Infectious Emotions at level 12, and basically it allows you and an ally who experience the same trigger to have the same reaction and enter the same emotional state. So if an effect would cause you to enter the anger emotional state, you could also pass that over to the party fighter as well. Now, they do note with Infectious Emotions that this feat is a little bit more difficult to use because it does rely on specific triggers. So if you are using the Cathartic Magic rules, consider the triggers for your emotional state very carefully before taking this feat, because certain emotional states and certain triggers might be less useful or more difficult to pass along to your allies. And in the book Secrets of Magic, they actually call out the Pride emotional state as a good example of this. The trigger for that emotional state is probably a lot less likely to happen to you and an ally at the same time, meaning that you're a lot less likely to be able to use it. Still, in the right circumstances, the ability to pass crazy emotional buffs to your party, I think that's pretty cool. Okay, now that we know the terminology and the different options available in the Cathartic Mage Archetype, now we can go back and examine the specific emotional states and see what each emotional state offers, both in terms of benefits and drawbacks. Let's start with the anger emotional state. The anger emotional state is described as a destructive wrath, and the trigger for the anger emotional state is when an enemy damages you, although they do note that you cannot use your catharsis reaction if you are fatigued when you take damage. The catharsis activation for anger allows you to attempt an escape check if you are grappled, immobilized, or restrained, and if you successfully escape, you can deal force damage equal to your level to whatever's trying to hold you down. While you are in emotional fervor, you gain bonus damage to any instantaneous duration spells that you cast, and you gain access to the Draw Ire spell from Secrets of Magic. However, when your emotional fervor ends and you enter emotional fallout, you become fatigued until you use the Settle Emotions activity. Finally, the focus spell for the anger emotional state is Athletic Rush, which takes a single action to cast and allows you to move faster and gain a bonus on any athletics checks associated with moves made as part of that action. The next emotional state is Awe, and it's described as an overwhelming sense of wonderment or amazement. The cathartic trigger is anytime you or an ally critically succeed on an attack roll or skill check against an enemy. The cathartic activation allows you to attempt to end a fascinated or stupefied effect that your character might be suffering from, and while you're in the Awe emotional fervor state, every round you can choose one enemy that you hit with a spell attack roll or who failed a saving throw against one of your spells to become fascinated by you for a single round. Also, while in emotional fervor, you gain access to the Glitter Dust spell, which is honestly one of my favorite things to throw out against rogues in a game, so kind of excited to see it show up. Once your emotional fervor is over, for your emotional fallout, you become flat-footed until you gain the opportunity to settle your emotions. And your cathartic focus spell is the Dazzling Flash spell, which allows you to attempt to dazzle or blind creatures in a 15-foot cone in front of you. The next emotional state is dedication, and this represents having a strong emotional dedication to a particular person. In fact, this is one of the emotional states where you have to pick a focus for your emotion. You're going to pick a particular person that you are, well, dedicated to, and who becomes kind of the focus of this intense magic that you can access. The trigger for the dedication emotional state is anytime you see your emotional focus take damage from an enemy that is within 30 feet of you. And the catharsis activation doesn't actually benefit you, it benefits your emotional focus, granting them temporary hit points. Then, while you're in your emotional fervor, any spell that you want to use to target your emotional focus gains the benefit of the Reach spell metamagic feat, And any spell that you cast can also grant temporary hit points to your emotional focus as well. Any temporary hit points that your emotional focus gains, either from the activation or from a spell cast during your emotional fervor, all have a maximum duration of 1 minute. And of course would follow any other normal rules associated with temporary hit points. During emotional fervor, you also gain access to the Spirit Link spell. However, once your emotional fervor is over, while you are in emotional fallout, you cannot cast spells at all unless you are directly adjacent to your emotional focus. As a side note, I really feel like the Dedication Catharsis Mage is really good for something like a Paladin or another non-caster class that wants to pick up a few spells to use to protect members of their party. That just seems like a really good mechanical fit here. Speaking of protecting your party, your Cathartic Focus spell is Protector's Sacrifice, which is a focus spell that you can use as a reaction to redirect some damage from your emotional focus to yourself. Next up, we have the Fear emotional state, and this one is a very interesting one because it allows you to play around with one of the most common penalties that gets thrown out in Pathfinder 2e, which is the Frightened condition. The trigger for this emotional state is when an enemy does something to make you gain the Frightened condition. And I promise this is not necessarily a bad thing. The Catharsis activation for this emotional state actually increases your Frightened condition by 1 up to a maximum of Frightened 4. So for example, if your enemy hit you with an effect that caused you to become Frightened 1, it would trigger your emotional state, and then your Catharsis activation would cause you to be Frightened 2 instead. Now, in case you're thinking that sounds like debuffing yourself, while you are in your emotional fervor, the Frightened condition does not actually inflict a penalty on your spell attack rolls. Instead, you gain a bonus on spell attack rolls equal to whatever your Frightened condition would be. So, if you were Frightened 3 or Frightened 4, that would actually give you a +3 or +4 bonus on spell attack rolls while you are in your emotional fervor. On top of that, if a spell that you cast would require a saving throw, your enemies actually take a penalty to that saving throw equal to whatever penalty your Frightened value might normally impose. So essentially, the fear that should be messing with you is messing with them instead. That's pretty sweet. Now, it is important to note, you do take all of the other penalties associated with the Frightened condition, so there's still a lot of risk to reward in this particular emotional state, but the supercharging of spells that this offers is pretty cool. Also, while you're in your emotional fervor, you gain access to the Fear spell, and the Cathartic Focus spell is Waking Nightmares. Both of these essentially allow you to inflict the Frightened condition on a particular opponent. When your emotional fervor ends and you go into emotional fallout, your character will automatically begin fleeing for 2 rounds. If the original source of your fear is still present, then you must flee from whatever that particular source is. If that source is gone, you must flee from the location where you encountered that source. But either way, emotional fallout will cause you to flee for 2 rounds once your emotional fervor runs out. The next emotional state is Hatred, and this is another emotional state where you have to pick a particular person to serve as the emotional focus for this given emotional state. So essentially, the Hatred emotional state is really good for portraying a strong rivalry if your character has a particular enemy or some other person that they are desperate to hunt down. The Hatred Catharsis Mage is going to be the option that's going to allow you to represent that well mechanically. The trigger for this particular emotional state is pretty straightforward. You start a fight against either the emotional focus of your hatred or one of the minions of said emotional focus. Basically, if the villain is there or one of his henchmen, you get this effect. It's pretty plain. By the way, the Catharsis activation is a free step or stride action that you get to take, and the only restriction on this action is you just have to end up closer to the object of your hatred. Now, the emotional fervor state for hatred is a little bit of high risk, high reward. I'll go ahead and tell you, while you're in emotional fervor, you gain access to the Blood Vendetta spell from the APG, but the main benefit of the hatred emotional state is that the target of your hatred is flat-footed against you and takes a -2 status penalty on all saving throws against your spells. And you are also flat-footed against your emotional focus, and you also take a -2 penalty on any saves against their spells. So it lowers your target's defenses by a significant amount, but it also lowers your defenses against said target, making this a very high-risk, high-reward emotional state to use. But if you want to play out that strong vendetta, this is the rule set to do that. When your emotional fervor ends and you enter emotional fallout, you become stunned 2. Straightforward, pretty easy to manage. And the Cathartic focus spell associated with hatred is Cry of Destruction, which is basically just a blast of sonic damage in a cone in front of you. Pretty simple, pretty brutal, pretty effective. Next up, for those of you who enjoy some unbridled enthusiasm, we have the Joy emotional state, where your positive attitude leads to success for you and for your team. The trigger for the Joy emotional state is anytime you critically succeed at an attack roll or a saving throw, or if an enemy critically fails a saving throw against one of your spells. The Catharsis activation here I think is pretty sweet. You automatically reduce any frightened or stupefied condition affecting you by 1, and you automatically end any persistent mental damage that might be affecting you. While you're in your emotional fervor, you gain a +1 bonus to all performance checks, as well as any spell attack rolls associated with spells that have the emotion trait, and your enemies take a -1 penalty on all saving throws against any spell with the emotion trait as well. You also gain access to the Hideous Laughter spell while in the Joy emotional state. However, when your emotional fervor ends, you become fatigued as a result of your emotional fallout, and you cannot end the fatigue until you take the time to settle your emotions. Your Cathartic focus spell for Joy is Unimpeded Stride, which allows you to immediately break any grapple or immobilizing effect, and then take a stride action to move away, ignoring any penalties to your speed. The next emotional state is Love, which is described as an intense bond to and affection for another person. Much like dedication and hatred, you must pick an emotional focus for the Love emotional state, and many of the abilities associated with this emotional state are going to affect the particular emotional focus that you have chosen. The trigger for the Love emotional state is anytime you see your emotional focus take damage from an enemy within 30 feet of you. And the Catharsis activation associated with Love is that you get an immediate save to end a confused or controlled effect that is on either you or your emotional focus. Now, if only one of you is affected by a confused or controlled condition, then whoever is affected is the one that gets the save. If you and your emotional focus are both affected, then your emotional focus is the one who gets that save to try to end the effect. While you're in the Love emotional fervor, you gain access to the Soothe spell, and you gain a +1 bonus on will saves. If you cast a spell that would benefit your emotional focus, that bonus to will saves increases to a powerful +3 instead. However, the emotional fallout when your fervor ends is that you become fascinated by your emotional focus for 1 minute. Additionally, the Catharsis focus spell associated with Love is the Soothing Word spell, which gives the target a bonus on will saves and has the chance to counteract emotion effects that might be hampering that particular person. So the next emotional state is one that mechanically might not get as much use as some of the others, but I think the narrative potential here could still produce some interesting story moments, and that is the Misery emotional state. You know what it is to suffer, and you enjoy making other people suffer as well, just like you've had to suffer. The Catharsis trigger for the Misery emotional state is any time that you would take persistent damage. It doesn't matter how much persistent damage or what kind of persistent damage you're taking. It's just the presence of persistent damage that triggers this emotional state, and the Catharsis activation grants you a number of temporary hit points that last for 1 minute to kind of offset any persistent damage you might be taking. Then, while you're in your emotional fervor, you can actually choose not to attempt flat checks to end any persistent damage that you might be suffering from. Why would you do that? Well, if you hit someone with a spell while you're in your emotional fervor, you can actually add persistent damage to them based on the persistent damage that you are suffering from. There are a lot of high-risk, high-reward options in this rule set, and I've got to admit that's something I love about this variant. While you're in emotional fervor, you can also cast the Phantom Pain spell. The emotional fallout for Misery I do feel is a little bit rough. You actually take a status penalty on any spell damage rolls until you have the chance to settle your emotions, and I'm not going to lie, that one's a little rough. But you do get access to a fun cathartic focus spell, Savor the Sting, which allows you to deal mental damage and persistent mental damage to your target. So there's definitely some fun options here. The next emotional state is the Pride emotional state, which is all about preventing the worst case scenario from playing out in game. Basically, as long as you can prevent the worst case scenarios from playing out, you can protect your own image. The trigger for the Pride emotional state is anytime you critically fail an attack roll or a saving throw, and the cathartic activation turns that critical failure into a regular failure instead. Then, as long as you're in your emotional fervor, anytime you cast an illusion spell, for the next round, if you would roll a critical failure, it again becomes a regular failure. Now, once your emotional fervor ends, you enter emotional fallout, where you become confused about reality and gain the confused condition for 1 round, and the cathartic focus spell is Veil of Confidence, which allows you to decrease any frightened condition that you might be suffering from, but it comes with a little bit of risk in that if you critically fail a roll against a frightening effect, the spell will cause your frightened condition to increase instead. Now, when it comes to the emotional fervor, they actually list 2 different spells that the Pride emotional state has access to during emotional fervor. One is Color Spray and the other is Mirror Image. I feel like this is a misprint, and I think Mirror Image is probably the actual spell that you gain access to during emotional fervor. At least that would be my guess based on the way this particular emotional state is themed. But this is something that you might need to look up on Archives of Nethys or in any official errata that Paizo has released, because I will admit my copy of Secrets of Magic, it does appear that there is a misprint in this particular section. For the last emotional state, we have the Remorse emotional state, which is described as a character who struggles with intense feelings of guilt. The trigger for the Remorse emotional state is anytime an ally drops to 0 hit points within 30 feet of you, and the Catharsis activation for this state causes you to step or stride towards that ally, but you must end the movement closer to them. While you're in emotional fervor, you gain a status bonus on the number of hit points restored by any healing spell that you use on your ally, and you gain access to the Warrior's Regret spell, which can be found in Secrets of Magic. However, when your emotional fervor ends, as part of your emotional fallout, you become stupefied too until you take time to settle your emotions. Finally, your cathartic focus spell for Remorse is Healer's Blessing, which is a buff that you can put on an ally and allow them to gain more benefit from any healing spell that you might use on them. So you can kind of see the Remorse emotional state as a very emergency heals focused version of a caster. And that is all of the options that Paizo has given us for Cathartic Magic, at least up until this point. Now, I definitely think there is some room for expansion on this particular rule set. If you're a fan of Inside Out, you're probably wondering why Disgust didn't show up as one of the emotions. And I'm sure creative storytellers and players could probably homebrew a few different emotional states that could be used in place of the ones that Paizo has directly given us here. But overall, I think you can see that Cathartic Magic is an incredibly diverse and flexible rule set that adds a ton of narrative potential to spellcasters in Pathfinder 2e, and can also add a fun spellcasting twist on classes that might not otherwise have access to spells. So overall, I think Cathartic Magic is an incredible option, and I am so glad that Paizo gave us this variant for spellcasting in Pathfinder 2e. But let me turn the conversation over to you. What are your thoughts on Cathartic Magic, and would you be interested in using this at your own gaming table? Let me know what your thoughts are as a player or as a game master, and if you've had some experience with Cathartic Magic in play, let me know about that in the comments section as well. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this particular rule set, because this is definitely a variant I want to implement at my own table. In addition to all of that, if you enjoyed this video, remember to like it, share it, subscribe to the channel. You can check out my Discord and my Patreon. I've got links to both of those in the video description. Once again, thank you for helping me experience the catharsis of joy with the fantastic community I've got here. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you so much for being a part of the conversation. Have a wonderful day.